Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Eric Kinman from the LSI Marzano Center, and I'm your host for today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome you to Does Your Evaluation Model Support SEL with Dr. Robert Marzano and Dr. Beverly Carbaugh. They will explore how to ensure your evaluation model supports equity, rigor, and SEL in your strategic plan. Our webinar today is scheduled for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Before we start, I have a few helpful reminders for today's webinar. First, your audio lines are muted during the presentation. However, we welcome your questions and comments. You may do so by using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. Finally, today's webinar will be recorded with a link distributed to you via email. Feel free to share the presentation with your colleagues who were unable to attend. Additionally, there are 4 handouts associated with this webinar. You can use the GoToWebinar pane on your right to download those handouts. With that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Dr. Robert Marzano is Executive Director for the LSI Marzano Center. He's a nationally recognized education researcher, speaker, trainer, and author of more than 50 books and 200 articles on topics such as equity, instruction, assessment, writing, and evaluation. Dr. Beverly Carbaugh co-authored with Dr. Robert Marzano the book School Leadership for Results, Shifting the Focus of Leader Evaluation. Her and Dr. Marzano also co-created the popular Marzano-focused evaluation models. Without further delay, I'll turn it over to Drs. Marzano and Carbaugh.
Well, thanks, Eric. This is Bob Marzano. I'm coming to you from balmy Denver, Colorado. We have our high today of 41 degrees. I think it's that right now. Bev, you're in Florida, right?
I am. I'm down in the Tampa, Florida area, and I believe our high, Bob, is sitting at 88 degrees. So I feel you, but I'm enjoying the heat myself. But today we're going to do some talking about social emotional learning. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say, and we're going to try to make some connections between social emotional learning and even teacher evaluation. But I think broader than that, I would be interested, along with our audience, to hear about your history with social emotional learning. And one of the things that I hope you'll be able to talk to us about is how should we position social emotional learning so that we as teachers and educators don't see it as one more thing?
Sure. Well, let me give you my background with this. First of all, I recommend social emotional learning in the context names sometimes different things. It's been around for already a long, long time. There's a report that's put out by Harvard Grad School of Education. It's funded by the Wallace Foundation. It's called Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. And that was just last March 2017. It's free if you go on the website. I just Google Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. And it gives a nice history of SEL and programs that are out there currently that are SEL in nature. Like I said, it's had many incarnations. The whole child movement had a lot of SEL aspects in it. The 21st century skills, that movement had a lot of SEL components in it. In other words, it really has been around for a long time. Now, over the last 15 years, it's become much more focused in terms of a kind of a common vocabulary. I really think it started with emotional intelligence. That was Goldman's book. Where it was a very popular book, and it was just a kind of a, came around at the right time where people thought, oh my gosh, there is a different type of intelligence other than just academic smarts, if you will, cognitive skills. An organization called CASEL, the Center for the advancement of social emotional learning. Now that might be, I think they've changed that acronym over the years. In Chicago, it's run by a great group. Roger Weisberg has led that effort for a long time. My personal involvement came from the thinking skills movement in the 1980s. And even back then, there were aspects of what we now call social emotional learning. I had the good fortune of working with Castle in their kind of early days, and when they were developing standards, if you will, for social emotional learning. And my organization at that time called Marzano and Associates, we were a consultant to that effort, and so I got to see that from the ground up. There's also a handbook for research on social emotional learning. I recommend that highly. Many theorists and researchers with chapters about various aspects of social emotional learning. I had a chapter on assessment. I was very honored to be part of that, at least in a small way. So part of your question was how do I define social emotional learning? Well, my work, I've always tried to start from research and theory. And have a good basis, a model that you always start from. And I'm going to give you that in a second, that model that we're operating from. In an informal sense, I define social emotional learning as being aware of the social and emotional forces that every human being operates from, being aware of those, and also then having strategies to control the negative aspects of those forces that work on us. And I'll explain that in a second here. So it's really about understanding, the human being. We all were born with certain tendencies. In a sense, part of being a human being is hardwired in us. We operate from certain motives. We're conditioned by our society, and that constitutes the social emotional context that we live in on a daily basis. The more we understand that, and also again the negative things that can happen from some of those tendencies, I think the more satisfied we are in life. So how does social, I'll give you kind of the overall model here in a second, but how can social emotional learning be addressed without having it be a brand new thing? So let me answer that. Eric, if you go to the next slide. Good. I'm going to make a distinction here between relative to social emotional learning, activities that enhance the social and emotional context for learning. That's one way of looking at addressing social and emotional learning, things that you do that enhance the social emotional context in which we live. And then there's another set of skills where you actually teach social and emotional skills and awarenesses. Now, last week I did a webinar on social emotional learning and focus on that top part, activities that enhance the social and emotional context for learning. Today I'm going to talk about the bottom part, actually teaching social and emotional skills and awarenesses, and then putting those together with how they fit into the model that Bev and I created for teacher evaluation, and talk about the implications all of this has for a model of teacher evaluation. So let's start here. Next slide. Here's a basic premise. We all live within what I call the human condition. I mean, again, we're born hardwired, with certain things, certain needs, certain goals. And that's where it all starts, operating from the assumption that human beings all have certain needs and goals. And there are many models for those. I'm going to use a real simple one that you're going to recognize right away. So if we look at the next slide. This is an adaptation of Abraham Maslow's, which actually was first published, I believe, the 1950s, and it works really well. I've stayed with my wife's clinical psychologist, and so we've kind of worked together, combining our careers at times. And so there are many other models about human needs and goals, but this one still works very, very well. Certainly people are very familiar with it, and it's really easy to apply the logic of this to what happens in a classroom. So if you remember Maslow's hierarchy, he said there are 6 levels of needs every human being is hardwired with. We're born with these tendencies. Physiological needs, need for safety, need for belonging, need for esteem, need for self-actualization. And the highest level is connection to something greater than self. And actually, he didn't put that level 6 until later on in his career, when he realized that there's something more than just self-actualization. His original model ended with self-actualization. So let me give you a metaphor here, which is maybe not so much of a metaphor as it is you know, a semblance of reality here. I want to assert that at any moment in time, human beings are metaphorically, if you will, kind of asking these questions. Am I physically, comfortable here? Am I safe here? Do I feel like I belong here? Do I have a sense of status here? Can I work on personally relevant goals here? And am I inspired? And that's the social emotional context we live in. We're always asking those questions. Certainly the first 4, the levels 5 and 6 are higher levels, if you will, that we don't, many times in life, you know, we don't have an opportunity to realize those goals. You know, we go to work and or we're traveling on the bus to work, and you know, it's not automatically set up for self-actualization or inspiration. Now, if you get a no on any one of these, Maslow would say, then your attention gets stuck right there. So if you flip that around, you might say, well, you know, for a student to have his or her needs met at the higher levels, schools and classrooms have to do something to take care of those lower level needs. Now, right now I'm talking about things the school has to do, and there are strategies relative and awarenesses relative for each one of those levels. So if a student is not comfortable physically, their attention is going to be on their discomfort. If the classroom is too cold, too hot, if they're hungry, you know, they're really not going to be able to think much about school. Let's go up. If a student feels that he or she is not physically or psychologically safe, they're going to get stuck right there. You get the idea. Okay, now, given that, we can start looking at, well, let's look at a typical classroom, you know, situated inside a typical school, and to what extent do we do things that address these needs? We actually talked about that a lot last week, so I'll give that, you know, I'll mention that briefly. And to what extent can we teach students awarenesses and strategies that help them become more conscious of these needs and can independently act in a way that gets those needs filled? So let's start with a straightforward one. Am I physically comfortable here? Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you listened in last week, you know, so far I'm repeating what I did then, but as I said, I won't focus on that. First of all, let me translate this human condition into kind of a way that we operate. We as human beings react all the time. So let me explain this. Along with these needs, some psychologists say we have a theory of the world in our head. And that was really coined in the early 70s. And I've loved it. I really have. It just makes sense. We have a theory about how the world works relative to all those needs, by the way. And that's learned over time. And it's kind of the backdrop of our thinking. You know, we're probably not aware of it very much or at all. Again, some of my wife's a really good psychotherapist. And that's what psychotherapists do, help uncover that theory of the world in our heads. And I'm not saying we should do that in schools, just kind of setting up a framework or a context for, well, what would schools do and what would teachers do to address these needs and also teach students about these needs. Then we have our needs and goals. That's, let's say, those 6 levels. Now, everything that happens to us, every new event that we experience, I mean, new person that we experience, remember we asked those 6 questions. A new event here, the student goes from English language arts class to math class. And we'll ask the question, do I feel, am I physically comfortable here? Am I safe here? Do I feel like I belong here? Do I have a sense of esteem here? Based on those answers, we execute what some psychologists call a script. So let me explain what the script is. When we're in a situation we engage in that situation, we automatically pull up these things that we're going to do. The most obvious one would be your script for what you do in the morning. If you think about it, you've got a script. You know, you get out of bed and maybe get some coffee, and you know, you brush your teeth and maybe watch a little TV, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that's your script. Now I'm dealing with, you know, a routine event in life. Same thing happens though with new things that come into our consciousness. A student walks into the math class and there's another student sitting next to him. That student sitting next to him, this student considers this person not a friend. Matter of fact, is frightened of this person. It's a threat to this person physically, and the student will then execute a script. And that script is, what do I do when I'm sitting close to a person I'm afraid of? Again, that's kind of an extreme case. Most of the time, students walk into school, they go into a class, you know, class is presenting new content, the teacher's presenting new content, and the teacher executes as, here's what I do when the teacher is presenting new content. Now, here's where it gets really tricky. Every new event or person that walks into our consciousness, we interpret them, and the interpretation is based on our beliefs. So I'm the student, I sit down, another student comes and sits next to me. I make an interpretation about the student, and usually it's pretty innocuous, it's just another student. But notice the interpretation I mentioned before. I interpret that this student, my interpretation, is actually a threat to me physically, okay? And therefore I'm going to execute a script to protect myself from this person or from what could possibly happen after school. Now, interpretations are based on our beliefs. You know, I have a belief about this particular student or particular types of students. And where it really gets a little scary here is the next piece, the danger of negative interpretations. See, I've already said I'm sitting in class, a student sits next to me, and I have the interpretation this student is a threat to me physically. That's a negative interpretation. So here's what happens. If it's a negative interpretation, I either get frightened, or a very related emotion is I get angry. And this is where emotions come into play. Whenever you have an emotion that deals with anger or fear, you now narrow your thinking. And if you read cognitive psychology, say, well, this kind of goes back to, you know, when we were in the caves and we walked outside and there was the saber-toothed tiger. Our interpretation rightfully is this is a threat, and we had to focus our thinking, you know, and act, you know, accordingly. You know, we couldn't make any mistakes. It's interesting, if you read that literature, they answer the question as to why do you think you remember the bad things that happened to you in life more than the good things? That's certainly true in my life, and everybody I've asked said, oh gosh, that's the truth. I bet you right now you could think over the last 2 years of those things that either really frightened you, you know, or made you really, really angry. And that, some psychologists say, that kind of goes back to how we're hardwired. See, it was important that when we were in the cave and went out and there was a saber-toothed tiger, that we remember, gee, if you turn right, you run into the saber-toothed tiger. So it was really a survival mechanism. Remember those things that cause fear or anger. Well, that worked, you know, for the cave person, you know, many years ago, but it doesn't work real well for the student in the classroom or the teacher up in front of a classroom. Because if you are thinking when you're angry or frightened, again, it narrows the options. You don't think in terms of as many alternatives as you would have if you weren't angry or frightened. So we have a reaction, you know, I'm frightened, I'm angry, I then execute a new script. And if I'm executing my script that says, hey, I got to protect myself from this boy next to me, probably not a lot good is going to happen as a result of that. That's what I call it the human condition. That's every day, we're going through that. We have a theory of the world in our heads. We've got these needs, people, events come into our consciousness, we interpret them, and based on that, we execute a script. And most of the time, it's really innocuous. It's fine. I mean, oh, gosh, now I have to do this. I execute my script for, okay, get on the bus. Gee, now it's lunchtime, I execute my script for that. But there are sometimes, again, it can be a person, an event, a task. We interpret it negatively. And then we act accordingly, and usually nothing good happens as a result of that. Now, that's a backdrop for understanding social emotional learning and actually addressing it in class and teaching strategies for it. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, activities that address physiological needs. Remember, that's the first level, if you will, in Maslow's hierarchy. Well, this is what we should do in classrooms, and this is what your evaluation model for teachers should have components that address. So we periodically assess the needs of our students relative to hunger, sleep, mental health, physical health, homelessness. I think we do a decent job of that, but we also have to, do this systematically. The school should know which students, literally are homeless. What about students who come in and they're sleep deprived? And the more we're aware of that, the more we can execute available resources and services as needed. And there are a lot of them out there. Well, I talked last time quite a bit about that. Let's go to the other side of this, though, and that is what awarenesses and skills can we teach students? So next slide. Okay, skills and awarenesses for physiological needs. Now we're talking about things to teach students. Awarenesses of requirements for a healthy lifestyle. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with good education? A whole lot. Gentleman I met a year ago is a physician in India, and he's creating a whole curriculum on this for rural schools in India, and it's fascinating. He says it's just basic. So the students don't have basic understanding of what a healthy lifestyle entails in terms of hygiene, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a legitimate part of the curriculum, if you will. Now we're talking about things that can be taught, embedded in certain subject areas. Strategies for addressing physiological needs that are not met. I mean, just think about it. If a student is homeless, are there things we could teach him or her, that they can do? Well, there are. They can teach students about, that there are resources available to them. A relationship between interpretations and physiological needs. Let me explain that because it's kind of a weird one if you think about it on the surface. Same story, India. If you go to places like India and go to rural schools, you might find that students in these schools where there's not electricity, there's not heat, there's not air conditioning, actually aren't as uncomfortable with, let's say, extreme heat as we would be in the United States. Stated differently, a lot of our perceptions of our physiological needs being met are also an interpretation. It's too hot here, it's too cold here. Now, please, I'm not saying we should teach kids, just to grin and bear it, but just that awareness that, wait a minute, how I interpret this it's coming from my theory, of how you have to feel at any given moment. So these are, again, highly metacognitive skills that can be taught. Let's go to the next level, safety. Okay, again, this is things we should be doing. No, before we go back, these are the activities. So these are things that we should be doing in classrooms and schools. Reach out to parents, but to provide them with strategies and awarenesses that enhance students' perceptions of physical and psychological safety at home. There are many programs relative to this, but it makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, I can't tell you how many teachers over the years have told me, I think we do a good job at school, but this student comes from an environment, that they're not getting this type of support in their homes. And I guess it's easy to say, well, gee, the parents are not trying hard enough. But more often than not, what you might find is a lack of awareness, it's a lack of resources, and reaching out, from the school or even the individual classroom teachers to parents to help them, give them ideas about how to set up the home that gives their children a sense of physical and psychological safety. Make sure the school has a comprehensive safety procedures. I won't go into this. That's obvious. In this day and age, I think we do a decent job about that. Let's go to the next one, though. This is where we teach strategies, skills, and awarenesses for safety needs. Well, some of these are fairly common, some aren't. Danger awareness, kind of healthy caution that can be taught to students. And this is a tricky one. We don't want now I've got 4 grown children, all of them went to public school, and I've got 6 now grandchildren. One's only a few months old, but the other 5 are all in public schools. You don't want to push this too hard. You really don't. But also, you don't want to ignore it. I don't want my grandchildren to walk around always frightened, but I do want them to walk around aware. And there are many strategies to this end. Just knowing when being aware of certain situations where you might have to be more cautious than in other situations. Again, this can be part of classroom management that we teach these things that can actually be embedded in health courses. Let's look at the next one. That's probabilistic thinking. And this is more important. No, I'm sorry. Keep it there on that slide. Thanks. Appreciate it, Eric. Sorry. This is particularly important for students that are getting to the place in life, usually teenage years, where they, have the opportunity. They're more independent. The adults are not around them that much. They have a lot of time to themselves to be with their friends. It's still the case that at that age level, they'll try things. They'll take risks, and sometimes risks that aren't really good risks to take. So here's what probabilistic thinking is. Now, obviously, I'm touching on things that have fairly involved strategies that back them up. Probabilistic thinking is just what it sounds like. When you're going to do something that might be dangerous, you ask yourself, what are the consequences of me doing this and it doesn't turn out well? Now I'm going to use one of my grandchildren, Jacob. Very, very athletic. Now he's not in high school. He's 11 years old, and he and his little friends, they're always running around. They're great kids. But they do, because they're so physically active and physically agile and skilled, they will do things that are dangerous. And this conversation we've had. As in, I live in Denver, I mentioned that, go up to the mountains and they climb on rocks, jumping from one rock to another, and they tend to challenge each other as to how far they can jump from one rock to another. Well, you can get the picture in your head. So we have actually talked about it. Before you do something like that, you got to think, what happens if I don't make it? So again, there's a whole set of strategies within probabilistic thinking. And then teaching students about physical versus psychological safety. With all of the shootings that have gone on in the last 2 decades, you can say, oh my gosh, students are they're actually not that safe in schools, and that's not the case statistically. Statistically, we're safer. Our students are in K-12 education are safer now, than they were years ago. No kidding. Even from violence due to guns, but we have these horrific things that take place. The reason I want to make this distinction between teaching them about physical versus psychological safety, even if you are safe physically, in terms of the facts, actually pretty safe sitting here in school, that doesn't mean you feel safe psychologically. So psychological safety, in terms of how it affects us internally, is about the same as actual physical safety. And that awareness, that distinction, sometimes it helps to alleviate their reaction. Classic example is flying. If you have to travel a lot and you're on an airplane, many people feel they're frightened. They really are. Remember, our whole world changes when we're frightened. It really does. You can't be satisfied. Everything is about this fear you have, for your physical safety. What happens though is that that can be mitigated if you have information about the safety of flying on planes. So it's still the case that we're much safer flying on a plane than we are probably driving to the airport. So making that distinction with students. And then there are actual strategies that can be taught to students, to help them even when they realize that they're in fear physically, but but they really aren't, that it's really just a psychological fear that they have. And there are ways of mitigating that fear too. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, now we're getting into more common fare in the classroom. Activities that address belonging needs. And boy, if you're in the classroom, now, or you're still very close to the classroom, this is obvious. The kids that need for belonging is so powerful. And I would assert once they get into the middle school level, it just jumps dramatically. Well, what are things the school can do? Remember, there are two types of things. Ways of addressing the social emotional context in which students live. One is things that we can do in the school to help those needs being met. Another is the strategies we can teach students. So these are the activities we can do in the classroom. Examine the extent to which the school and classrooms provide an inviting atmosphere. And I think this was Stuart Perky's work a number of years ago, where he just made a simple distinction that we do things unknowingly and unwittingly that are inviting to students. They're saying to the students, hey, this is a place, we value you, you belong here, we want it to be pleasant for you. And just the opposite, we do things that are disinviting. And no kidding, just even asking students, what are the things that I do in my classroom that are inviting? Say to you, you belong here, I want you to be here, thinking of you. What are the things that I do that are disinviting? You'd be amazed what you get. I remember one example of, it's a really simple little survey that are asked of students. It'd be done at the school level, obviously. I remember one example of the student saying, the teacher had done this, well, it's disinviting when you tell us that we can't chew gum, but you walk into class chewing gum. No kidding, things like that. Or they'll identify, gee, we really like it when you play music when we come in. And that might sound like all periphery stuff, but from this perspective, it's not. If it's true that we live life in this social emotional context, which is based on our needs, our innate needs, and that's very, very important stuff. And if Maslow's right, and we don't attend to these needs, we're really kind of making it very difficult for students to get to the higher level things, to even just to focus on what we might be teaching in class. Next one, utilize strategies that contribute to a respectful, that should be learning community, sorry about that, a respectful learning community and a learning environment and learning environment. Utilize strategies to produce an environment of affection and cooperation. Let's go to the skills side. Let's take a look at that. Next slide. So these are things we can teach relative to belonging. Now this gets a little more heady and complex, I would say. Awareness of the need to belong to a group. That's a big one right there. Just teaching students about, hey, don't feel badly that you want to belong to a group. It's fine. It really is. We all do that. But next bullet, that is positive and negatives of belonging to a group. In the absence of a group we belong to, we'll attach ourselves to kind of any group that's around. But that might not be in the long run very positive experience for us. I know enough about gangs to be dangerous here in terms of overgeneralizing. But my understanding is kids don't join gangs to hurt other people. Kids join gangs because they want to belong to a group. And that need is so strong that they will even they do things that they don't like, they don't think are right or good, just to belong to that group. So analyzing the characteristics of potential groups before you're involved. What do they do? What do I have to do to belong? What's expected of me? And is that something I'm really comfortable with? Analyzing the effects of group membership on relationships outside of the group. And again, you know, my 4 kids and 6 grandkids, there have been times in life when, you know, this has affected our family life, that our, you know, our kids' friends, you know, and that their group of friends was so powerful to them. But this group promoted behaviors that really helped, that really were negative relative to their home relationships. Now, you know, remember, we're talking about K-12 students, and they might not have this awareness. Notice we're talking about skills and awarenesses. You know, that you join one group, and the behaviors that make you part of that group, are they affecting other relationships you have that are just as important, if not more important? Let's go up to esteem, because I think that's the one that in schools right now that kind of the most tangible, it's almost palpable, students' needs for esteem. See, belonging, just what it sounds like. We all need to belong to groups. Above that is we want to have status within the groups too. We really do. That we have a, you know, we're not just a new member, you know, we're actually valued within that group. So these are things we can do now in the classroom. Emphasize and celebrate students' academic growth as opposed to status only. So human beings, part of the hard wiring is that we want to be, you know, want to have high status relative to other people, but equally as important, if not more, we want to see that we're growing ourselves. And I want to see if we can show students that they grow, you know, that this need is really met. But now we have to focus not so much on have they met the standard, but how much have they grown. Acknowledge and celebrate students' accomplishments outside of school. So, you know things about your students, particularly the disenfranchised students, if they're engaged in any outside activities, you know, that you can acknowledge, compliment, make known to other people. Maybe it's sports or music. And I've got a nephew who's a rapper. And I'm not a fan of rap. I don't understand it, but he sure loves it and is apparently very, very good at it. Just to acknowledge that these are accomplishments in his life, even though I don't understand it. Allow students to set personal goals and celebrate their accomplishments. Now, many of these things, well, you know, I'm sure you know you do. You've seen teachers do, so they're common fare in a lot of places. Let's go though to the next slide. Things we can teach, skills and awarenesses for esteem. Just the nature of esteem within a group. Just, you know, where you talk about that, what does it mean to have esteem within a group, and why does it make you feel good? And this is actually going back to teaching them that you know, you do have needs as human beings, and here's 6 levels of needs. There's a lot from the world of clinical psychology. Just teaching them, I guess the basic message to student is you really don't, to have esteem, doesn't have to come from your place in a group. Esteem can come from yourself, and there's a certain way of thinking, you know, that about yourself, where you don't need others, you know, approval to have a sense of esteem. There's a gentleman named Harold, a clinical psychologist, and he talks about beliefs relative to high esteem versus low esteem. I'll just read a couple here. Believing in oneself and one's abilities, feeling comfortable in one's own skin, knowing and clearly expressing wants and needs, having the ability to laugh at oneself, accepting responsibilities for our actions. Again, these are things that actually can be taught to students. As I said, I've been in part associated with the SEL movement for a long time, and for years now I thought, you know, this represents a curriculum in and of itself, because it's teaching students so strongly, you know, about how we are as human beings and things that are just innate, and the good parts about that and the not so good parts about that. Relative to esteem, even teaching students about thinking patterns that all human beings tend to have, ways of habitual thinking that don't work for us. For example, this one's from McKay, Davis, and Fanning. Common thinking errors and patterns, or common blaming, Just in your own life, we had periods of situations where we tended to blame other people. Written statements, I should be doing this, not that. Catastrophizing over time, emotional reasoning that, if I have strong emotions, whatever I do is, appropriate. Remember, strong negative emotions tend to narrow our thinking. Let's keep going on. Now they're at a stage in life, my peers, where they have the time and energy to pursue what they really want to. So one is being one of my friends, an ex-university professor. He's a carpenter. And he's always wanted to do that, and he's played around with it a little bit. And some people take up sports. A lot of them are engaged in politics really deeply because they have the time and energy to do it. Even young kids, though, have these desires that they just want to do it. So each year have students engage in personal projects along with the associated metacognitive skills that they need to accomplish those projects. That son I mentioned, grandson I mentioned, Jacob. He's a fifth grader now. If you had asked him, what do you want to do as a third grader? What do you want to be in life? He'd say, I want to be Neymar, the next Neymar. That's the world's best soccer player, apparently. So he had those goals. That's a dream. Now, it's not important that he accomplishes it or not. Who knows? He might. What's important is that he pursues it right now. And when he's doing that, he's completely engaged in it. Periodically, have students examine and develop their images of their possible selves. This is the work of Hazel Marcus, a great cognitive psychologist. And she said that we all have developed possible selves, or she calls it future possible selves. We think about, gee, in the future, I could be doing this, and I could look like this, and I could have these type of friends. She says those are kind of these visions, that we can call it daydreaming, and a certain amount of it is, but those guide us, to actually cultivate those. There's such a thing as a negative possible self too. And I don't recommend we do this next thing I'm going to mention in the classroom. But my wife is a psychotherapist. When she deals with people who've had strong addictions to drugs like meth, they use negative possible selves. And she would say, well, look, if you continue this habit, let's look up what happens to people's lives. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the pictures kind of before and after of these of people who've got hooked on meth, and in very short order, what it did to them physically. And again, I'm not saying we do this with students in K-12 education, but still, we have a positive possible self and a negative possible self. And just that construct is very, very powerful in terms of our goals, and our working toward goals or not. So let's look at things that we can do. Things we can teach. Planning for long-term goals. First of all, just that is a strategy, how you plan. Revaluing and resiliency. It's actually part of the goal-setting process. We all know about setting long-term goals. That's great, and timelines and working backwards. And actually, a lot of schools teach that stuff. But what happens if you don't reach your goal? And you realize you can't. Let's say my grandson wants to be the next Neymar, and he gets all the way up through senior year in high school, and something happens. He hurts his knee, and a career-ending injury. Hope to God that doesn't happen. But let's say that did. Is all lost. Well, that's where revaluing comes in. Revaluing is when you can't reach the goal. Well, what did I do? What have I accomplished? And can I still use all that I've done over the years? And the answer is yes. You talk to people, as they get older, they say, gee, I didn't accomplish X, and I worked on it for 2 years, but I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now had I not failed in that. And obviously, resiliency is closely related to that. It's almost by definition what resiliency is. I have a goal, I don't accomplish it, but I say, wait a minute, I can still use this stuff and accomplish something else. The power of mindset strategies. You all know the growth mindset. Carolyn Dweck's great work. Learned optimism is really very similar. That's Martin Seligman's work, where they're actually very, very powerful strategies here. But it all begins with teaching about, you have a mindset, with which you're approaching things. And there are different mindsets. And You know, if you using Carolyn Dweck's work, if you have the fixed mindset, you're approaching things with the idea of, hey, I either can do it or I can't. I'm either skilled or not. If you have the growth mindset, you know, you approach things with the idea of, hey, if this is important, I want to do it. It's not my skill, it's my effort that probably will pay off. Seligman's learned optimism is a little more complex, but really in the same vein. Future possible selves fit in nicely here too. They really do. Let's go to that last area. Activities that address connection to something greater than self. Now, remember, Maslow put this in later on in life. He said, "There's, you know, there are experiences people have that are transcendent, you know, where it kind of gets them out of their current situation, and even if the situation is not good, you know, they're satisfied. Maybe this is highest level of satisfaction. Provide students opportunities to engage in altruistic projects. At least once a month, expose students to inspirational stories. Every 2 weeks, present students with quotations that are inspirational. I'm a big, you know, a fan of sports, and John Wooden was one of my favorite coaches. If you don't know who he is, look him up. But I think at UCLA, they won the NCAA championship. I think it was about like 13 times. He was a big fan of quotes. You know, you listen to the players who were coached by him. He was always had quotes, and he would talk about them. At least one every 2 weeks, teachers provide anecdotes about inspirational experiences they have had. But now let's go on to what we can teach students. Next slide. There you go. The power of service-oriented relationships. You know, and I think even at a young age, students can realize this, that you actually have to give them experience, obviously. But boy, that when we do things that we're helping other people, it just kind of get us out of ourselves. You know, we don't think about what the things that are happening in our life, because the opportunity to actually enhance the lives of others is overrides that power of inspiration. I think that is literally a skill that we should teach them. Look for situations that are inspiring. Read inspiring things. When you're depressed, seek those things out. And then analyze what inspires you. You know, what is it? Get down to, gee, why does this movie make me feel the way it does? That I feel moved by this. And if you do that, you discover part of that theory of the world in your head. You know, you're inspired when you see a movie that lets you believe that, gee, something you'd liked, a way you'd like the world to be actually, you know, is true, or possibly is true. Okay, now taking you a long way there. So for our SEL is really understanding the social and emotional context in which we live. You have to have a model for that. Using a model of goals by Maslow, and then an understanding of how we interpret different events. Okay, let's take a look now at a model of instruction. Keep going. Keep going. I think I'm going to skip this. Keep going. Sorry. Actually, I better fill this one in. Kind of a baseline strategy to teach students, given this model, is if they ask these questions. You know, particularly when they're angry or frightened. So what's my interpretation of this person or event? Does this interpretation make me angry or frightened? If that's the case, watch out. So what am I going to do? It means what script am I going to execute? Will this have positive long-term consequences? And if not, should I do something different? High-level skill, but very, very powerful. So now let's take a look at the teacher evaluation model from the perspective of, does the model address some of these levels? So if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is we started with a model based on the art and science of teaching, and then with Bev's great experience in the field, we actually created the more focused model that has standards-based planning, conditions for learning, standards-based instruction, and professional responsibilities. Not so much professional responsibilities, but the standards-based planning, the conditions for learning, and the standards-based instruction all have components that incorporate some of the aspects of the model that I just gave you. So let's take a look at the standards-based planning. Yeah, Planning standards-based lessons, aligning resources to standards, and planning to close the achievement gap using data. See, when you start looking at the achievement gap, you're automatically getting into the question, why are some students not, learning at the rate of other students? And I think we tend to say, okay, well, wait a minute, it's all socioeconomic status. And certainly there's a truth to that, their access to resources. But I would assert that along with that are also beliefs that students have acquired, possibly, given their circumstances. In other words, the planning forces us to look at, how are the students who aren't achieving? How are they approaching the world? Is it different? What about their beliefs? Is there anything we can do? Or is it there are some basic needs that just aren't being met for those? Bev, you want to jump in on that one? Yeah.
Following right along with you. We're good.
I said, did you want to jump in on this one? No?
No, we're moving right along here.
Okay. Let's go to the next area then. Standards-based instruction. Now, these are the elements that deal with strategies where we're helping students learn content. If you look at that list, pretty straightforward. But actually, almost every one of these, you can relate to one of those levels. Let me go to the bill now, helping students engage in cognitively complex tasks. Remember self-actualization? Self-actualization, almost by its very nature, requires the ability to solve complex tasks. In our model, we talk about decision-making, problem solving, investigation, experimental inquiry, revising knowledge. This gets back to mindset thinking. If you come from a fixed mindset, you don't even think about revising knowledge because it's got to be right from the very beginning. Now we're running out of time here, but I think you get the idea that if you think of instructional strategies from the perspective of student needs, what you'll start to see is you can think more broadly about these. It's just not about cognitive complex tasks. You're actually giving students practices and things they might be able to use, relative to some goals that they personally have. Let's look at the next area.
And Bob, before you do that, the other one that really fits beautifully there is students examining their reasoning. As you were talking earlier, that's the one that really jumped out at me. So these instructional strategies really do support.
I haven't lost you.
Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next section.
Okay, conditions. Now, last week we did a webinar on this, just only looking at conditions. And the conditions for learning, by definition, address many of the levels of Maslow's hierarchy. They really do. Engagement strategies, maintaining effective relationships with students, that's belonging and esteem, communicating high expectations for students. So when you address the conditions for learning, tacitly you're addressing some of the levels of Maslow's hierarchy that we're using. I want to go to that top one, using formative assessments to track progress. Remember I said emphasize growth, student growth relative to esteem. Well, in our model, that's where it happens. If you are tracking their progress relative to specific topics and you're using a formative assessment approach, you'll be able to identify how they started, what score they started with, and where they ended up with. What we tend to only look at is where they ended up, and that's status. But if you look at where they ended up and compare that with where they started, you've got growth right there.
Anyway, and you mentioned providing feedback for that incremental success, not just for status, which is the next element. So it all works together very cohesively.
One more slide here. We have this is for the teachers, as they use this particular model. If you use our model, this should be familiar. What we're shooting for is the applying level. And at the applying level, the teacher is not only executing the strategies. Now, the strategies would come from one of those areas we just covered, but they're also monitoring whether it has the desired effect on students. Now, this is the part where you're analyzing students, their reactions. So again, it's a different frame here. You know, the model we presented for the social emotional context and that whole thing about theory of the world in our heads, these human needs, and making sure we meet them in school, but also teach students strategies. When you get to the applying the innovating level on the scale, what that means to us is that you're also thinking about the social emotional context for students, and then even teaching them some awarenesses and skills. Well, I didn't leave much time, did I? Do we have any questions though?
That's okay. That's great. It is very thorough, and I think it's very applicable. We do have some great questions coming in, and I'll just dive right in if you'd like, Bob and Beverly. First question is, how do I get my teachers who are more focused on CCSS to become more tuned to modeling SEL skills in the classroom?
Well, I think it's an awareness. I mean, that's why, we start with a model. I mean, there's not to criticize other approaches, but a lot of the SEL approaches I see are really teach resilience, teach the growth mindset, teach this, teach that. And those are good. But I think, and this is the reason we've done it the way we've done it. If you start from, let's look at how human beings operate. Let's look at the inner life of students on a moment-to-moment basis. And we used a very simple model here, but I think once you start thinking that way and realize it, and usually the big aha for teachers is as they're going through the model, they realize, oh my gosh, that's me. I have a need for esteem. I have a need for belonging. I have a need for self-actualization and connection to something greater than self. When you realize we all operate from this common human condition, all of a sudden you see students differently too, and I mean, that's how I got hooked on it decades ago. I thought, oh my gosh, this is the other curriculum, kind of the tacit curriculum we should be. So I think it has to be, it's not buy-in, it's really, let's try to understand students as human beings. By definition, when you're doing that, we're understanding ourselves better as human beings.
So to extend that a little bit further, then, what's the best way for a teacher to uncover needs of specific students?
Well, you've got to understand. First of all, you have to have a model. So, please use ours or somebody else's, and then you start thinking that way. And this is such a straightforward model that, and there's so many strategies out there for it. I just ran through them, but I mean, really, let's take that first one, physiological needs. First of all, individual teacher, kind of hard to do yourself, but it can be a school-wide emphasis. We can, there is information about which students are homeless and which students are coming to school and they're not fed properly or they're cold. Some of them you get up to the higher levels, and that's it. Yeah, you have to kind of look for cues in class. Probably already know which students don't feel like they belong. Which students don't have a sense of esteem, within the classroom. So I think, the experienced teachers kind of naturally look for those levels, and certainly physical safety we take care of. I think the top two levels, self-actualization, connection to something greater than themselves, we tend to ignore. It's easy for those to not be addressed. But that said, I see a lot of classrooms virtually. Okay, every day I'm virtually looking at one or more classrooms because of some work we do here at Marzano Research. And I would assert that the teachers who in general get the greatest results are aware of that. There is a need for students for self-actualization, and there is a need for them to be inspired. So I think we do this anyway, just to have a framework that you use to kind of mentally check. Gee, have I thought about their physiological needs? What about safety, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How should SEL change or affect lesson planning?
Oh, well, I think at one level, remember I broke this up into two different things that can be done. One is to make sure that we're doing things to help students. So that goes directly into lesson planning. It really does. I mean, you can kind of, on the side say, gee, do I have to be thinking in terms of their needs for physiological comfort, and how do and my guess is we're taking care of that. Physical safety, How about their needs for belonging? Do I need to do anything, today or this week to make sure that every student feels like they belong? Sense of esteem. The ones where we probably have to add some activities, or gee, how do I build in self-actualization here? And that by definition means getting to, gee, how do you think you can use this? What are you interested in? What do you want to do? And then inspiration. I mean, the ones we mentioned, that can be little stories that are told, vignettes, little video recordings that you can, use as a, at the end of class or at the beginning of class. So all of that can be built in. Teaching them strategies, that's another level up. We'd actually have, again, that's kind of the second curriculum that we'd have to build in.
Mm-hmm. How can we measure SEL? So for folks looking to see the data, how do you measure SEL in a classroom?
Well, two ways. One is actually there are surveys out that get at these types of needs that that you can just ask questions, real simple surveys. But that deals with are we teaching? Are we meeting these needs in the classroom? I think it was, oh my gosh, who's the big survey group? Gallup. They've got surveys that deal in great part with these needs of students. I wrote a book with Daryl Scott, the person who created Racial's Challenge. It's called Motivating and Inspiring Students. In the back of that, we have a survey that is actually free online. That address these 6 levels. If you want to actually teach skills, then you have to define these skills and create what we call a performance scale for each one. There's been work on that, quite a bit of work. Castle, I believe, still has those different types of proficiency scales. So you're measuring 2 things. One, are we meeting the needs of students? And the other is, are we teaching students the skills? And for that, you have to actually operationally define what is the skill? What would students be doing if they're executing the skill?
Right. And for the audience, CASEL is an acronym CASEL.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Final question. What would you say to a teacher who says, quote, if I had to make sure every student was comfortable in my class, I'd never get to the lesson?
Well, we don't have to make sure, but we have to try. This is something that's not a one-shot thing. You do a little bit each day. And see, I think there's a school part to this that's really important. Individual teacher, you can't create this in a school by saying, okay, every teacher in this school now do this. It has to be a school level initiative. In other words, the school is doing things to ensure that all of this is going on. And then individual teachers are executing some of those strategies. So there's a cumulative effect to all this. There really is. It's not, I'm getting on a bandwagon, it's my soapbox here. We can't just keep pushing everything down to the teacher level and say, that's a great idea, now you guys do it. No, you got to do it at the school level first, and then it naturally trickles down into the classroom level. So you can't just read a book or watch a webinar and do it. It's got to be an initiative.
And that framework, that evaluation framework, helps bring consistency to the school and also transparency from the teacher to the observer and on up, right?
Yeah, just kind of another, I would assert, if you really like what we said here and kind of have this in your head, and you looked at our model, you would see that model differently now. When you observe, particularly when you got up to, on our scale for the teachers, the 3 and the 4, the applying and innovating, you'd be looking, remember, that's where the teacher is monitoring the effect on the students. So you'd have different eyes that you use to observe the students. You'd be looking much more broadly, interpreting what they do much more broadly.
Okay, great. Well, that was the last question. Dr. Marzano, Dr. Carbaugh, thank you so much. Our audience, thank you. As you close out the webinar, there will be a few questions that pop up. We greatly appreciate your responses. Thank you, everybody, and we will end the webinar. Thank you.